All right, welcome to another episode of the Credder Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, and with me today is Yehong Zhu, the founder and CEO of Zette. And just a little bit of background on Zette. Zette is bringing down the barriers to real news by allowing you to access premium digital news content behind article paywalls. Yehong, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Chase.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming. We've been talking through email for a while. It's great to finally have you here, and we're going to dive into some interesting discussions today, starting broadly about paywalls, subscriptions, these kinds of things that are impacting how we consume news today, and maybe how that'll look different in the future. And then we're going to zoom in on the great work you're doing at Zette. So kicking it off, I kind of wanted to know, just broadly speaking, what you think are some of the biggest challenges facing news consumers today. And obviously, some of what you think might have to do with paywalls, but broadly speaking, what are some of the biggest challenges for online news consumers or the industry as a whole?
I think for readers of news, there's always a challenge in figuring out how to get access to the right sources. And also, discovery has been a huge challenge. How do people actually find news today? How do you find news, right? A lot of times it can be really random, it can be shared on social media. But even within social, if links are paywalled, it's really difficult to actually share the full story behind the paywall. At least in my friend groups previously, what I would see happening is that people would copy and paste the text of articles into group chats in order to try to share the content, or they would just share Instagram reels or TikTok videos of the same news coverage that a reporter would write because it was more accessible in a different medium that more people could access.
Yeah, and accessibility is really the big crux of the issue with paywalls, because although paywalls make sense from the ability for a publisher to monetize their content and do so without having to necessarily rely on advertising, it does create this kind of side issue where the affordability of everybody to access this premium news and information, it becomes less accessible and less affordable for some. So how do you kind of think about that issue more broadly? Just the idea that once you have paywalls, it means you are kind of, to some degree, siloing the access to quality information from those who have the resources to afford the subscription and those who don't.
Yeah, it's a really tricky question because I can see arguments on both sides. I understand why newsrooms do it, especially because programmatic advertising alone isn't enough money to sustain journalists and payroll and all of the fees that are associated with producing really high quality journalism. But then the issue becomes too that misinformation is really rampant and it's always going to be free. It's always going to be not behind a paywall per se. And so there's a greater question here of, well, what's a better way to democratize access to content without, bankrupting journalists and news outlets, but also in a way that makes it easy and accessible to the general public so that you don't have to have a high paying job in order to afford the ability to read the news every day. I think it actually should be something that most people could afford if there was a better way or a better solution to access content.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, that misinformation or disinformation is not going to be behind the paywall, because that's not the purpose that it's trying to solve. That's a really interesting point. One of the other things that is changing about paywalls and these kind of subscription services is actually what the modern day paywall looks like. It used to be kind of this idea of a hard paywall. Maybe there's other terminology for that, but this concept where you just can't get in unless you're paying. Now there's a lot of websites that'll give you maybe 3 free articles, and then they'll cut you off, or maybe they'll give you the first half of one article. There's all this different kind of approaches to hard versus soft paywalls these days. I'm curious what you think the future of the paywall looks like. Is it kind of this iterative version we have today, or will it look like something totally different?
Yeah, so today there's three different types of paywalls that are really prominent within the industry. There's the hard paywall that doesn't give away any articles for free. To read a single article, you have to subscribe. There's a metered paywall, which the New York Times really popularized, where they have a specific number of articles that they give away. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 5. It could be less, it could be more. But after you've crossed that threshold, you have to pay for a subscription in order to read anymore. And then what's becoming more and more popular is the email registration wall. And I'm sure you've seen some of these
Yeah.
websites too, where instead of asking you to put your credit card down, it asks you to sign up with your email account, put a password down, and you don't have to pay money, but you do have to give your information. And as we're kind of moving forward into the future, I see a lot more email registration walls popping up, not least of which because of the cookie apocalypse. I don't know if you've heard, but Google's actually getting rid of third-party cookies. And so all the cookies that normally advertisers or publishers might put on a consumer's computer, they now have to find alternative ways to get access to that premium first-party data. And so a lot of times paywalls are a way for publishers not only to get access to more revenue streams for their content, but also to actually form any kind of relationship with the reader itself, to track where the reader is reading, to understand why they've left the page, or to even be able to contact them in the future. More and more so, I think we're relying on paywall solutions.
Right. And to some degree, the concept of a donation is almost also like a subscription, but just with no paywall whatsoever. Because it's this monthly recurring kind of Patreon or GoFundMe style monthly donation. Do you think that the future of publishing is going to be a mix of publishers accepting subscription revenue, advertising revenue, donation revenue, and it's just going to be kind of a more diversified revenue stream? Or do you see one of these models actually winning out in the long term?
I think publishers should be open-minded to all different kinds of revenue models. One of the missions we have at Zette is that we're not here to destroy the paywall or take down the paywall. We think it's a very valid business model. We're simply here as an additional source of revenue on top of ads, on top of paywalls, another way that you can open the door to pay per article content per se. And publishers are constantly innovating as well. There are a lot of creative ways in which a lot of publications make money these days. TechCrunch, for example, hosts conferences and TechCrunch co-ops. Vogue, I believe, pays for all of their editorial costs with the Met Gala sponsorship. The Forbes 30 Under 30 Summit has become an event in itself. And so a lot of the times the conference and these events and other sources of revenue are what enable these outlets to continue producing the high quality journalism they currently produce.
Okay, and maybe one last question on kind of this concept more broadly, and then we'll zoom into Zette, is just the idea that there seems to be a limit, and maybe it's different culturally or based on geography, but a limit to the number of subscription services any individual is kind of willing to pay for on any given, monthly basis. So do you know what the kind of up-to-date number is for that? Is it 3, 5, 10? Are there super users who are going to fund most of them, but most people don't pay for anything at all? What's the kind of makeup there?
Yeah, so according to some recent survey data, about 1 in 5 Americans pay for news of some sort. And on average, they only pay for one subscription. And statistically, it's the New York Times.
Right.
So take that data as you will, but there's a serious subscription fatigue problem that we've seen where it becomes expensive and unrealistic to even pay for subscription number 2 or number 3 if you're already paying for one. And that's a problem that we've seen with user research and interviews as well. When we ask people, would you pay for more news? It's typically the minority of people really who are paying for multiple subscriptions, like half a dozen or a dozen. And even they say that they don't have time to read all the news for all the subscriptions they've paid for. And in some cases, they don't even remember when they paid for it, how much they're paying for, what their passwords are. So a lot of the subscription side of things needs innovation, to say the least.
Yeah, that's one other piece of the kind of subscription revenue model for why a publisher would like this approach is that if you get somebody's credit card and you have them subscribing, people tend to forget what they're subscribing to, and they tend to forget or maybe don't pay attention to that $7-12 a month cost line item on their bank statement, and they might not even remember that they have the subscription or be taking advantage of the subscription, but that's recurring revenue for the publisher. So there's a little bit of like a passive revenue stream there too. And then what you kind of mentioned, this 1 in 5 news consumers are paying for news, and even those folks are only paying for one service. We're kind of seeing and have kind of it's been forecasted for a long time that something similar was going to play out in the video streaming world. Now that we have, Hulu, HBO, Netflix, Disney Plus, all these competing streaming services, and it seems like that has finally happened in recent quarters, where Netflix actually showed their first negative user growth since they became a streaming site. And I think a lot of that has to do with this concept that, again, people are only willing to subscribe to maybe one or two at a time. They might cancel. And that's the other thing about this, is there's almost no switching costs, right? I could subscribe to the New York Times for a couple months, turn it off, subscribe to the Washington Post for the next 3 months, and then turn that off and come back to the New York Times and catch up on the archive that I missed before. And the lack of switching costs here also kind of plays into this. But let's zoom into Zette now. Let's just give you the floor for a second. Tell us about Zette. What is the problem that you guys are solving in the industry and for news consumers?
Yeah, so the genesis of my idea behind Zette started when I was a journalist at Forbes magazine. I was in the national newsroom for the first time and had landed this dream gig. And one of the things that really surprised me was that Forbes, which is, symbolic of American success and money and fame, they were actually struggling, like many prestigious news outlets across the country, with their business model, right? With the transition from print revenue to digital. And as I was keeping a really close eye on this, I noticed the ripple effects that it had across the organization and across even the way that Americans consumed news, right? For example, if a premium newsroom has high costs of employing journalists and editors and fact checkers, but they don't charge for their online content, one way that they could create revenue would be ads, right? So you might end up having articles that are just filled with advertisements, and that's maybe not the best user experience for the reader. But then on the other hand, if the reader turns on ad blocker or some sort of software that disables the ads, the journalists don't get paid. And not only does it affect the editorial incentives, where we have to almost write more clickbaity articles to get more and more views so that we can get more and more eyeballs on the ads, but it kind of has these downstream effects where then the whole industry becomes more and more clickbaity, as it's like a race to the bottom, right?
Yep.
And so I just clearly saw that there is a strong need for more revenue and also more innovative business models and products. And I could also see that the industry was going to turn towards subscription paywalls. It made a lot more sense in terms of having a direct relationship to the reader, having more lifetime value, like you mentioned, when people subscribe and they end up becoming subscribers for quite a long time. The news industry in general has, really strong lifetime value amounts for consumers. But there's going to be a tragedy of the commons problem that I think we've seen materialize today, where if everybody paywalls their content, how does the reader even start to figure out what they should read, much less how many subscriptions, much less could they even afford it or remember their password. And so we're getting to the stage now where the market is really crowded in terms of your options for what you should subscribe to news-wise, or even the number of paywalls out there for articles that you might even only want to read occasionally, right? And so the whole concept of paywalls makes sense for heavy readers. If you keep hitting the paywall again and again, it makes sense as an investment that, hey, I actually really want to read a lot of these articles. Maybe I should just pay for unlimited access. But for the rest of us, the experience that I had as a journalist and as a reader was that I would browse across the internet, across websites. I would find an article here from Bloomberg, an article there from the Times, an article there from The Economist, and I would want to read all three of these papers without necessarily getting into a relationship with them in the beginning. And so this concept of pay-per-view was really resonating in my mind at that time. And iTunes had a similar success with paying per song. And then later, Spotify and also Netflix showed tremendous success with streaming, that instead of owning, like a long-term relationship with each individual musician or going to buy a ticket for a movie, what if you could have one subscription and you could have access to a wide library or a wide variety of sources, but only when you needed them. So you paid for what you consume, but not more than that. And I thought that this was such an obvious idea, really, that it was going to pop up in the market at any second. And so after I worked in at Twitter as a product manager in 2018, uh, I saw an increased need for the startup over and over again, particularly as Trump was tweeting every day about fake news and, how journalists were liars and all that. And that really hurt me as a journalist. And the thing that hurt the most was realizing that, he was kind of right. It's really difficult to read real news. It's hard to kind of click on an article and continuously get blocked by paywalls and then have to make a purchasing decision right as you were thinking you were going to get more informed.
Right.
And this problem was sort of magnified through social media, through platforms like Twitter, where the algorithm itself would promote links that were heavily engaged with, and paywalled articles naturally didn't have that engagement because no one could really read what was behind it. And so the problem seemed so obvious, and it really inspired me to really quit my job, to take this leap of faith, to start Zette. And I've learned a tremendous amount since then, and I'm happy to kind of dive into more.
Yeah. Well, so to follow up on that point, then a user that is subscribing to Zette is paying the subscription to Zette, and then Zette, well, what does that monthly or yearly subscription look like?
So we're starting at $9.99.
Okay.
And it's a similar model to ClassPass or Audible, where instead of having unlimited access, you actually get credits. So in our case, $9.99 will buy you 30 credits, and you can spend those credits across any of our partner sites in a given month. And every month they'll refill. So kind of like use them or lose them. And we think that this is a really good model because it encourages users to choose what they want to read. And also it has enough, let's say, money that we can give back to the newsrooms per article that it makes sense for newspapers and magazines to partner with us as well.
And what does it look like trying to create those partnerships with the publishers? Are they receptive? Are the bigger names kind of saying, no, we want to own our direct relationship with these subscribers? And I guess also on that point, how do you decide which partners to go after?
Yeah, it's a great question. One thing I've learned through my experience building partnerships with publishers is that it's all it's all relationship building is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
These are people at the end of the day whose industry has been highly impacted by all sorts of change, who are trying to adapt in tough economic circumstances, and whose entire livelihoods depend on what kind of solution partners they partner with, or what's next on their roadmap. And so I think the fear there of, are we making the right decision? Are we innovating fast enough? Is this going to hurt us or help us? I think is really real in the media industry, particularly if you consider how tech essentially decimated their old business model, right? How, I think 50 years ago, newspapers were one of the most lucrative businesses that you could have. I think Warren Buffett was someone who said, like, if I could have any business, it would be a printing press in like a one paper town, right? Because it's essentially a monopoly.
Right.
Now, the internet has so democratized access that it's hard to convince people to pay for all these different subscriptions, because there's just so many other outlets who are printing kind of the same news, right? And so helping publishers see opportunity instead of fear has been one of the jobs that I've taken on, and also helping them see, hey, there's so many users out there, there's so many first-time news readers who are interested in subscribing, who want to subscribe. They might just not have that user behavior yet, right? There's a lot of people out there who look very different from the typical Wall Street Journal subscriber, who might be in his 60s, is like an executive at a company. His EA probably is subscribing to the papers for him, right? And that's genuinely, honest to God, the typical profile of a lot of news subscribers. And the America that I see today is very diverse. There's a lot of young people who want to be civically engaged, who want to be informed about the world around them, who are curious, who care about self-improvement, who care about getting promoted at work, who care about making more money. And news actually is a way to help them get access to that information and to help them achieve their goals. But they don't want to, be super committed to certain brands, or they want a lot of optionality, right? And so they're looking for a service that can give them wide accessibility, affordability, but also ease of use. And so that's why I think that a technology gap is what we're really looking at here. And just conveying that to publishers and conveying to them that we do understand our demographic and that we can help them access kind of new audiences with Zette is something that I'm very passionate about.
Yeah, and to the point of optionality, is the long-term goal, and I can imagine that technologically this might be very difficult at first, but is the long-term goal to allow any website or publisher that has a paywall to opt into your system and therefore credits would be able to apply to their paywalls? Or do you guys want to kind of have a tighter control around what this network of publishers that you have this system working for, who those publishers are?
Yeah, that's a great question. We want to find a balance. So we definitely want to extend access to as many publications as possible, but we don't want to have misinformation on our site. We don't want to have extreme views either on the right or on the left, right? We want to basically vet publications based on their history of journalistic integrity, their reputation, whether they're a reputable news outlet. And there's different ways to kind of measure that, maybe even if they've won journalistic awards for their reporting in the past. And actually, the surprising thing might be that not every outlet is actually behind a paywall. If you really look at it right now, there's maybe a couple hundred of the most read websites that are behind paywalls. And of those, there's maybe 20 to 30 that are some of the most widely read papers in the world. And so there's actually quite a finite list of publications, but this greater question of, well, how do you kind of compensate and include a wide variety of premium journalists is also something that we're thinking about, because there's a lot of great writing out there that's not behind a paywall, but they're also struggling with the same questions around monetization. And we want to be able to provide a solution for them in the long term as well.
Okay, so as of right now, though, if you're a publisher or an individual journalist that is not requiring any kind of subscription or paywall, they're not really relevant to your solution.
Not at this moment in time, but I was inspired by the concept of Reddit Gold, where credits or tokens are kind of given out for good content, regardless of whether it's free or paid. In Reddit's case, it's always free. But just the thought of tipping, right, or some sort of tipping function, or similar to Patreon, where good content should be rewarded, right, is something that I think could be very easily built into a future revenue model at Zette, and the revenue that we generate could definitely be shared with the content providers, even if their content isn't behind a paywall. But of course, it may be on like a voluntary basis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, and if I could kind of sum up what I'm hearing, it sounds like to some degree, you could be shortcut to explain Zette as the Spotify for paywalled content, or paywalled news content. And at Credder, we liken ourselves to the Rotten Tomatoes for news. It's obviously just, it's not a perfect explanation, but it's a useful shortcut. Gives a person who's hearing about you for the first time kind of a foundation to kind of try to understand your concept with. Do you guys lean into this kind of Spotify for paywalled news tagline, or do you try to not use those kinds of shortcuts?
We like it, but sometimes shortcuts can be confusing. If
Yeah.
I introduce that as a Spotify for news, a lot of times people will ask, oh, so I can listen to my news through a podcast? And I'm like, no, not exactly, right? And then if I introduce us as the Netflix of news, they'll ask, oh, okay, so you do short form video content of news. And I'm like, not exactly. So that's why sometimes with analogies, there can be ambiguities. But sometimes I also say we're the ClassPass of news, right? Because we have this credit-based system. Right. And similar to ClassPass, where you can go and pick different classes at gyms, even if you're not a member of the ballet studio. For us, we hope that you can read different premium articles, even if you're not a long-term subscriber to the partners that we have access to.
Okay, and are you able to tell us what some of those partners that you do have access to today are?
So we're partnered with 80 premium publishers at this time. We're waiting on PR rights to kind of announce it officially. So it's a little bit under embargo at this time, but we're very happy to announce it in the press, and we'll have a lot more news for you soon.
Okay, great. And the last time I was on Zette, it was kind of sign up for the wait list, email sign up approach. What is kind of today's status of the platform, where you guys are, and maybe what's coming around the corner later this year or early next year?
Yeah, so we're hard at work building out our beta product. A lot of the work that we're doing involves integration with publisher websites. So if you think about what it takes to unlock paywalled articles, we have to literally integrate with maybe 80 to hundreds of sites. And each site has, believe it or not, different paywalls.
I
So
believe it. I believe it. Yeah.
so it's not just like we can build out one solution and it magically works across everyone. We have to kind of individually figure out, okay, so what is the best integration pathway for these different sites? And of course, there are easy ways that we could just hack through the site and we don't need any integration whatsoever. But we're trying to work with the publishers and we want to have them also see that our users are verified and asking for permission so that they could also, see that this is an ongoing relationship rather than just hacking through the JavaScript in order to be done with integrations more quickly. So that's kind of why it's taking a bit of time, but we're very optimistic that, a couple more weeks, we'll have the majority of our integrations done. And then in the future for our product, in terms of our roadmap, we really want to create a mobile app because 70% of news readers actually find news on their phones. And there's no way at this moment in time that people can legally unlock individual articles without having to subscribe directly to the news site. And we think that that's a huge miss because oftentimes, especially when you're on your phone, if you think about it, you just click a link and it's really hard to even see like credit card information that you're trying to input, or a lot of companies don't have auto pay or Apple Pay kind of integrated. And so how are you even going to subscribe when you're like on the subway trying to read a news article, right? And so the way that we're planning to engineer our app is to make it really, really easy, one-click access in order to unlock given articles as long as you have app downloaded. And that's in accordance to our long-term vision as well.
Okay, so let's kind of walk through what a user might experience. Let's say they have the Zette app. I'm guessing there's some kind of a feed on your page of content.
Well, there could be various ways that they could unlock content. So maybe they could go to our mobile website and they could actually input the URL onto our site and they can unlock it there. Or another way is that they could have our app downloaded. And then every time they hit a paywalled article on Safari or somewhere else, they could open the share sheet, say open with Zette or unlock with Zette, and it can either unlock the article right on Safari or it could take you into the Zette app and unlock the article there. So there's options that we could do to engineer that solution. But the point is that we really want it to be very simple and accessible.
Okay, and I'd imagine that if somebody's used up their credits and they want to unlock an article, Zette might allow them to kind of, it might be a moment to upsell them on a higher level of subscription that unlocks, another 30 credits. Is that kind of how that would work?
Yeah, that's definitely in the roadmap for now. We definitely want to have different tiers of usage so that we can be a usage-based platform, kind of like you pay for what you read. We also think that's quite fair for both readers and publishers because, for readers, it makes sense that if they want to read more, they can buy more credits. And for everybody else, if they only are happy with 30 credits a month or the kind of base level subscription, then that should be fine and they could wait for the next month of credits to refill.
Okay, cool. And so let me ask kind of a maybe a little bit more challenging question, but obviously publishers, they've done a lot better recently to become tech savvy. And I by no means suggest that this would be easy for, all the world's publishers with paywalls to do, but what would stop each of them from individually creating this per article paywall where they could kind of cut Zette out of the equation? Is there anything that you guys are doing that is unique that maybe makes it harder for them to be able to just go around you?
Yeah, we think that this solution has to come from a third party just because if every publisher did a per article solution, you would still have to have your account and credit card information on every single publisher site,
Right.
potentially dozens or hundreds of times. So it still wouldn't really be that much easier for the consumer if you think about whether you would want, because a lot of times the reason why people don't subscribe is not because of necessarily the cost, it's because of the inconvenience. And so it would take some sort of third party aggregator to develop these relationships across the board rather than being something that an individual publication could do and it would solve a problem with the consumer.
That's a great point. Okay. Great. Well, A few more questions for you here. There's two questions that I ask at the end of every podcast, but before I do, where can our listeners go to learn more about Zette, about you, follow you on Twitter or wherever you're putting out content about your company?
Yeah, you can follow us on Twitter at Zette Media. That's Zette Media. And you can follow me as well. I'm at Yehong Zhu. And then finally, you should sign up for a waitlist at www.zette.com. And we'll definitely send out updates about our product and our beta launch as we get that. So thanks so much for supporting us.
Yeah, I'll have all those links in the show notes. So last two questions that I ask every guest on the podcast, they're pretty out of left field, just kind of get people off of their normal talking points. The first is Bitcoin. How closely do you follow it? Is it something that you personally think of as an investment, as a Ponzi scheme? Is it something that might be integrated for micro tipping and Zette? Just what are your general thoughts on Bitcoin?
I think Bitcoin has been extremely volatile as of late. I'm sure you've been following the markets and you've seen the latest crash. I'm personally optimistic that it'll climb back up. And so I actually invested in Bitcoin after the crash. Fingers crossed that that becomes a prudent financial decision. I think only time will tell. In terms of its applicability, though, I think that in early 2015 or 2016, I was really excited about the concept of using Bitcoin as a microtransaction in terms of their tipping potential. And I actually implemented like a micro tipping QR code on my personal website to see what the experience would be. What I found is that the gas fees were actually too high for it to be a reasonable use case for micropayments. I think to tip like $1 in Bitcoin, it cost like almost $1 at the time. And so I think that hopefully the gas fees will lower so that it becomes more usable. But right now, without kind of some sort of tokenization of a different currency that can be easily exchangeable, it's hard to use Bitcoin or cryptocurrency directly for these smaller transactions unless the gas fees are just next to nothing. So that's the main issue that I've seen with crypto as a microtransaction. But I think that in the future, who knows, like the sky could be the limit in terms of what we're doing at Zette. It feels a little bit like cryptocurrency, right? Because there's these token systems, these credit systems that you can use to exchange for content online. But yeah, I think there's still kind of like a wide open field of possibility there. And I'm excited to see how the industry evolves in the future.
So just to double click on that, because it's true, what Zette would be doing with these credits is kind of like a utility token in a way, right? It's tokens that allow you access to paywalled content. Is there any thoughts about some kind of a blockchain integration or going crypto, or is that a bit kind of outside of your guys's current product roadmap and maybe even not something you're interested in touching?
It's definitely interesting to me. It's definitely something that I've thought about, but I have to come back to the core values of Zette, which include accessibility, right? So I think Web3 right now for the majority of Americans is still pretty inaccessible and still pretty technical. And certainly for the majority of publishers, right, telling them that we're a solution on the blockchain might scare like almost all of them away. So yeah. I think for now, for our industry, we're going to be focused on a Web 2 solution, but you never know, right? In the coming years, how the industry will evolve, how applicability of these tokens or cryptocurrencies will evolve. So we want to stay up to date. We want to stay modern with the evolving times. And so you never know, maybe check back with me in 3 to 5 years and we might be a crypto company at that point in time.
Okay, sounds good. And last question for you here is, are we living in a simulation?
Yes, I think I've recently been seeing all the glitches in the Matrix, and it's pretty.
You might be the one then, if you're seeing the glitches.
I mean, if you think about how magical life is, it's actually kind of unsettling, right? How you can have a thought one day that you wanted me to be on your podcast, and the next day you reach out and here I am. You've literally, had a thought that you turned into reality. If that's not magic, I don't know what is. Yeah. And then on the wider societal scale, I had a thought that, journalism should be more accessible. Here I am 2 years later after pursuing this company, and we're on the cusp of realizing my dream. And so I don't think that magic is out of reach, and I don't think that a normal world without kind of the matrixy simulations would allow you to cross or bridge that gap so quickly. And so I think that's something that I think about all the time and try to utilize in my day-to-day life.
That's beautiful. Basically saying that the argument for simulation is that we are able to create, and that it's just such a magical gift to be able to manifest things in your own life that it can't possibly be natural. It must be given to us, gifted to us, paid for in a previous life or existence or experience somehow. All right. Well, any closing thoughts for us on Zette and kind of what you guys have coming up? Otherwise, it's been terrific to have you on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chase, for having me and for hosting this podcast. And yeah, I just think it's great that you are shining a light on the different trends in the industry of media in general, especially given the impact that it has on all of us and how much it affects our worldviews. So yeah, just really grateful that you invited me, and hope everybody had fun listening as well.
Yeah, everybody go check out Zette. This is Yehong Zhu, CEO and founder, and we'll look forward to maybe inviting you back on in 3 to 5 years when crypto is out of the bear market. All right.
Everywhere.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.